Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 looks at family forms and our changing society. This chapter is going to preview some of the trends about marriage and family forms in America as they are demonstrated by U.S. Census and Pew statistics. So let's get started. Let's look at some marriage trends in America. In 1960, 85% of American adults reported that they were married. However, if you fast forward to 2014, that number drops to 70% of American adults reporting being married. So we see a marked decrease in the number of people who are legally married in society. However, if you look at page 38 in your textbook, there's a table that addresses how many people in the United States are cohabitating, and this is based on millions of people. If you look at the chart that they provide, the bar chart, in 1998, it reports that there were approximately 3 million American adults that reported that they were cohabitating. However, if you go to the year 2000, that number increases to over 5.5 million adults. So what we see is perhaps there's a reduction in marriage rates, but there is an increase in cohabitation. So obviously cohabitating and being married are similar, but not the same, right? We can say that a marriage is probably seen as more stable in the sense that there's a legal partnership, that people have to deal with legal documents in order to get married. Then in order to dissolve a marriage, there are extensive legal things that need to be handled to do that. Right? So it is more difficult to get into a marriage and out of a marriage than it is to cohabitate, right? So in that sense, we can say that marriages are typically more stable, but we cannot assume that just based on legality, right? I think it's interesting to look at the communication impact in the family system based on whether people are married or cohabitating. Your book discusses some of the communication trends and tendencies that tend to play out for couples who cohabitate prior to marriage, all right? And I encourage you to look at some of that research so that you can be informed. Many people in college choose to cohabitate during that time in their life for various reasons. For some people, cohabitation in life is because they want to try on the person as like a sort of a trial marriage to see if this is someone that they could see themselves being with. For other people, they're simply cohabitating because they want to consolidate resources, right? It's less expensive to live in one apartment, to have one car. So there are lots of reasons why people may enter into cohabitation, but the general trend in terms of the communication research is that people who cohabitate prior to marriage tend to have less positive communication outcomes than people who do not cohabitate prior to marriage. Now, there is one caveat in that research, and what we found with that, and again, this is discussed in your textbook, Beth Lepore goes into some depth with this, but they found the research shows that if people are engaged to be married prior to cohabitation, that those people actually enjoy all the same benefits in the relationship and the communication and in reduction of negative conflict strategies, that the people who are engaged before they cohabitate, before they move in together, right, then those people enjoy the same benefits as the people who wait to live together until they're married. So we can speculate about the fact that people who are cohabitating perhaps are doing it for a variety of reasons, right? And so that may influence communication in that family unit, but it is definitely something worth considering and consulting if you are someone who is thinking about cohabitating prior to marriage, or simply just having a cohabitating relationship in general and foregoing marriage at all. The research shows in 2014 that the average age of marriage for males was 29, and for women it was 27. It should be noted that if you go and look at these rates in your textbook, that the average age of marriage for males about 15 or 20 years ago was 24 or 25, and for women it was 22 or 23. So, and then you can even go back farther, like into the 1950s and 60s. And in that era, there were many, many people who were settling down and having families at the age of 18, 19, 20. So we really see that there are different trends in terms of marriage rates, the ways that people are choosing to have long-term relationships, and of course, there are lots of implications in the family form. I hope that it is not a surprise to you to hear that 50% of first marriages end. According to the US Census Bureau, the average marriage will last about 7 years. So this is a sobering statistic, which of course encourages us to want to explore all options that we may have for premarital research, counseling, looking at various issues that play out in communication in the family once you get married and have children, right? Although 50% of first marriages end, that doesn't mean that if you decide to marry or to have a long-term relationship that you cannot be successful. I strongly believe that if people are willing to work hard enough on themselves and on their partnerships and their marriages, that anybody can be successful as long as they're willing to put the work and the dedication and the commitment into that relationship. So don't see the statistic and lose faith. The statistic should just motivate us to be open to seeking out all the resources that we have at our fingertips so that we can be involved in long-term partnerships that are satisfying and that last a long time. Now, 40% of marriages that take place in the US every year are remarriages. So again, this points to the fact that there are changing family forms. Many of these people who go into remarriages are going to bring children into those remarriages with them, right? So of course, the blended family system has a whole myriad of challenges that they face that are unique to that system. Unfortunately, 2/3 of remarriages will end, okay? So the divorce rate for people who are in second or third marriages, or even fourth or fifth, is much higher than even for people in first marriages. So again, this is not intended to discourage you, but it should be sobering in the sense that, you know, you recognize that if you are in a long-term relationship or considering one, that it is strongly advised by many experts and by your professor that you seek out research and resources and counseling so that you can look at yourself and look at what your expectations are, what your needs are, and in doing so, you can hopefully select a partner that is going to meet those needs effectively. And once you end up partnering up, if you find yourself in a challenging situation, then that you seek out the resources, help, counseling that you need to resolve those situations. It's very important to acknowledge that the process of conflict in life is normal, and in many ways it can be a healthy thing in a relationship and in a marriage. What we want to do is we want to strive to make sure that we have conflicts take place in a positive way. We don't have to be perfect, but we have to learn to manage our emotions and express them in a responsible way so that we can work with our partner so that we can both meet each other's needs as we meet the needs of the family unit, okay? So I hope this slide has been useful for you. Keep the faith because love is definitely worth it. So let's look at the trends surrounding nuclear families, all right? And just as a reminder, nuclear families exhibit 2 biological parents who live at home with their children, okay? Now, in 2016, the US Census reported that 69% of children are living at home with 2 parents, okay? But this does not assume that all of these households have the 2 biological parents and the children, okay? But still, it is interesting to look at the trends and how they're changing because in 1970, 88% of kids were living at home with 2 parents, all right? So we can think about how the process of having 2 parents at home shapes a child's experience, right? Now, in most of these cases, we have, in 2016, 69% of kids living at home with 2 parents, right? in most of these cases, we can assume that those parents are the biological kids' parents, okay? So there are several benefits that children and families experience when you have two parents at home, right? One of these advantages deals with the emotional and physical health of the children and the family. Now, children who have two parents in the home, presuming that the home is a healthy environment where there's good positive communication, those children enjoy increased emotional benefits, right? There's more stability in the home. There's more resources in terms of adult care, right? There's two people there to provide nurturing and control for the kids. Also, physical health tends to be better among children who live in homes with two parents, right? Presumably, again, this is dealing with not only resources in terms of time with their parents, but also things like economics, right? Because what we do tend to find is that family systems that are nuclear tend to do better financially, right? And again, this is related to the fact that most nuclear families have dual incomes because most parents are now working jobs nowadays. So there are more resources. Given that nuclear families are intact, there tends to be more networks that people have been establishing over the years, over time, right? And there is a sense of being involved in the community, having a community to be involved in, right? So the intact nuclear family system, across much of the research over the last 40 or 50 years, does show that children do tend to fare better in most cases when they come from intact nuclear families. Now, this is not to say that people who are single parents or people that are in blended families or people that are gay parents are not providing good, stable environments for their children, right? There is also lots of research that shows that single parent households and gay parent households and households that are blended families can actually really enhance a child's experience because it exposes them to different types of situations that help them to become more resilient, that help them to develop creative problem-solving strategies, things like this, okay? However, the research has been done and it does generally show this, but knowing this information, if we ever do find ourselves in a situation where we happen to be a single parent, for example, then we can look at these kinds of research trends and we can target those kinds of issues in a special way so that our children end up faring better off, let's say, than other kids who grow up in single parent households. Many people are choosing to be married without children nowadays. In 2012, there were 28.7% of people in the US that reported that they were married and did not have children. Some people are choosing to forego having children completely because they want to focus on their careers or they want to build financial resources or financial stability. Other people are choosing to delay having children until later, and then when they actually get around to it, they find that it's more difficult to conceive because they're older, or perhaps they have other things going on with their life which would make it difficult, right? Other people are just deciding not to have children because they don't want to leave a big environmental footprint, right? There's people who think about the environment and how many resources are consumed for every one human being and how much pollution is left behind. So we can think about all of these things and perhaps why people are choosing to just not have kids at all. In general, people who do not have children show that they have higher satisfaction in their marriage than people who do have children. Your textbook talks about this, and they state that in general, when people add a child to a marriage or to a relationship, there is a marked decrease in relational satisfaction upon adding that child to the family system. And in many cases, the relational satisfaction does not go back up again until the kids leave the house 18 to 20 years later. So you can think about the stressors that children bring into a household, right? When people don't have children, there is less stress on a day-to-day basis. There's less to do. There are less chores. There's less strain that people have to deal with in terms of their careers and in terms of being a good parent, right? You can also think about the fact that people who are married without children enjoy more time to talk with each other, to have quality adult conversations, right? without having to focus every conversation around raising the kids, getting the kids to school, handling appointments, dealing with healthcare, dealing with soccer, dealing with band practice. I mean, there's just an unlimited supply of things that married parents deal with, right, in terms of making sure that their kids are developing in a healthy manner so that they can become full people, right? So it takes a lot more time, a lot more energy, and obviously a lot more money to raise a child than it does to not have a kid. Recent statistics show, I believe it was US News and World Report, that the average cost of raising a child from 0 to 18 years of age costs the average family about $250,000 per child. This is before college expenses or any kind of additional expenses that we might incur helping our kids trying to become developed in terms of their professional advancement. So we do see that in general, people who are married across the board, okay, people who are married with children, people who are married without children, in general, people tend to enjoy better health, and they tend to be have more financial resources, right, more stability if they are married. Now, what's really interesting about this statistic, though, is that for women, the benefits of marriage are only something that they enjoy if they are satisfied in the marriage, whereas for men, it does not really matter whether they're satisfied or not. They tend to enjoy the benefits of marriage. So they get to enjoy better health, better financial security, all of these things, right? A better sense of well-being, less depression. Your book talks in detail about some of the benefits. So I think this is something that's interesting for us to sort of pack away, especially if you're listening to this and you're considering long-term partnering or marriage, that marriage satisfaction is an extremely important part of leading a fulfilling life. And so anything that we can do to enhance the likelihood that we will choose a good partner and to increase the likelihood that we will be able to sustain a satisfying marriage is something that we want to think about doing. And of course, premarital counseling is a very good idea, both in terms of individual counseling, so you can get a better sense of, why it is that you view things the way you do, how you expect your marriage to be. You go in with all of these expectations about how to deal with conflict and how to deal with in-laws and all of these things, or even how to deal with children if you're going to have children. And a lot of times it's very useful for people to go and talk about these things prior to getting into a marriage individually, but also it's very useful for people to go to premarital counseling so that they can talk about some of these expectations. I believe that if more people integrated premarital counseling and counseling during marriage, that I think our marital satisfaction and marital survival rates would be higher in the US. However, you have to be dealing with people who are willing to go to counseling. And some people have a stigma and they don't want to go to counseling. And so, of course, it's very difficult to assist when there's difficulty with these kinds of things. So let's move on. Let's look at gay couples with and without children as a family form. In 2016, according to the UCLA School of Law, there were over 700,000 same-sex households in the US. Half of these were married. Approximately 114,000 of these 700,000 couples are raising children together. Now, in many of these couplehoods or marriages or long-term partnerships, 68% are raising children that are biologically theirs, whereas 21% are raising children that are adopted. Now, gay couples with and without children experience many of the same benefits that heterosexual married couples experience as well. So again, we see that people who are married in general experience higher rates of satisfaction in life. They tend to enjoy better mental health. They tend to be better off physically. They tend to live longer, right? And emotionally, they also tend to be a happier people as well. We can also assume that people who are in long-term partnerships or marriages who are gay enjoy things like having greater access to resources because, again, in many households, both adults are working, so you have dual income, dual salaries coming in, which of course increases the resource base for the family to draw from. when they do have children, or even if they decide not to, it decreases the level of stress, right? Having more resources available. We also see that people who are in long-term partnerships or marriages tend to enjoy greater access to community and long-term networks, right? This is the idea of the fact that people stay in the same community, perhaps living in the same neighborhood. They enjoy the benefits of having, people around them that they know, friends and family, perhaps a church or a university or various other types of community resources that help people to raise children that are socially, emotionally, mentally, and physically healthy and competent, right? So much like straight couples who are married with and without children, gay couples with and without children are also fulfilling the needs of nurturing and control in the family system in very similar ways. And so I think it's very interesting for us to think about it. And one thing that I also wanted to say is that with the recent legalization of marriage across several states in the United States and also many places in the world, it's been a very positive thing for gay people to be able to be married legally and, of course, to have the social institution of marriage as well to enjoy. Now, in the past, things that were challenging based on legality of not being able to get married had to do with some of the things we were talking about in an earlier lecture. So let's refer back to the legal definition of marriage, right? Or the legal definition of what constitutes a family, okay? And in a previous lecture, we talked about the fact that according to the law, if you are not related to somebody by blood or by marriage, then you are not considered to be family, right? Now, these kinds of issues are extremely important in terms of things like healthcare or health situations where people need to have their partner with them in the hospital or helping them in the hospital or, in any kind of a medical situation like that. Okay, these kinds of situations play out. But we also have the management of resources in a couplehood as well, right? So I remember hearing about one person who talked about, and this was before gay marriage was legal, and I remember hearing about one couple that I knew, and it was a female couple, and they had been partners for something like 30 or 40 years. And I guess they were not able to, I guess the house that they owned legally belonged to one of the women instead of both of them. And so there was a situation where something ended up happening to one of the women in the partnership, and her long-term partner that was left, right, that did not pass away, basically ended up getting booted out of the home that they had shared for 30 or 40 years together by the woman who had deceased, her family. So her family came along as the legal next of kin, right? And they were able to actually say to her long-term partner of 30 or 40 years, this house is ours and you need to leave now. So, this is a dramatic situation of what can happen for people, when they don't get afforded the protections of the legal sanctity of marriage, right? The legal sort of stamp of approval, okay? So some people who are gay choose not to get married. They just choose to be together in various types of relational forms, whether it's living together or, living at different homes and sort of seeing each other when they want. But I just think it's important for us to acknowledge that with the development of gay marriage rights and legal gay marriage in many states across the US, this has really afforded a lot more stability and protection for many gay couples in our society. And I think that regardless of what your orientation is, I think that we can all appreciate the fact that, all of us would appreciate or would benefit from having legal protections in place for, those kinds of situations where we want them and need them, right? Okay, so let's move on to the next family form. Let's look at the case of single-parent household family forms. So a single-parent household consists of one adult parent and at least one child. The reality, though, is that oftentimes single parents have more than one children. In 2016, the United States Census Bureau reported that 23% of kids were living with a single mom. 50% of children, though, will at some point be living in a single-parent household. 84% of these children will live with their mother. Although fathers are showing more involvement and participation and more single parenting than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Women still tend to take on more of the parental responsibility following the dissolution of a marriage or something like that. And unique strains and challenges that single parents face relate to issues of time, resource management, greater stress and role strain, reduced mental and emotional health among single parents, especially among single mothers, okay? So you can imagine a situation, for example, when you have a single parent where resources are short, okay? There's one person who can work and provide for the family. Oftentimes what that means is that that one adult needs to work multiple jobs, 2 and 3 jobs, or work really long hours at the job that they have in order to be able to make the ends meet so that children can get their needs met in the home. When we look at poverty levels among children who are raised by single mothers, we see that they tend to be higher than children who are raised by single fathers. Your book talks about the fact that poverty among single mothers tends to be somewhere around 35%, whereas poverty rates among single fathers tend to be more around something like 14 or 15%. So we can look at the way that gender, or whether you're a male or a female, shapes your experience being a single parent, right? We can also look at things like how much education or work experience people have prior to becoming a single parent. Obviously, those who have had time to develop a career that's gainful or that allows them to bring in a good amount of money are going to be better off financially than people who become single parents prior to completing high school, completing college, and prior to getting that professional experience that's going to help them bring in more money, right? So we can look at things like that. We can look at issues related to time. So single parents, because they're often working in order to make ends meet and because they have to work long hours, single parents essentially just have less time to give their kids than people who live in households with 2 parents, right? So you can imagine a single parent who's been working all day, and the children, of course, have been at school, and presumably in a lot of situations with single parent households, the kids come home and there's not going to be a parent in the household probably because the one parent that they do have is going to be at work, right? Now, people can do a lot of things to try to get flexible hours, to try to be there when their kids are at home and things like that. But the reality is, for single parent kids, many more of them are what they call latchkey kids than people who come from dual parent households, right? And by the way, a latchkey kid, if you don't know what that is, that was a term that was developed, I guess, in the 70s or 80s when I was growing up. And a latchkey kid is someone who comes home from school and does not have the supervision of a parent or an adult in the home until much later in the day. So for some of us, what that looked like was you would get home from school and then maybe your mom or dad wouldn't come home until 5 or 6 in the evening, right? So then they would make dinner and then they'd help you with your homework, and then you'd have to, deal with baths and getting ready for bed and all of this stuff, okay? So for the children, it's a greater stressor being in a single parent household because they don't get the same kind of time, attention, and love that children who are in dual parent households are able to have just by the fact that there's another adult around, okay? Now, I'm not saying that single parents are not able to love their children, okay? What I'm saying is that there's just less resources given that there's 50% of the adults in the home compared to dual parent households, okay? And you can try to imagine what it's like for kids who have to come home from school and be in an empty house with only their siblings for 2 or 3 hours a day. That allows or affords children a lot more opportunity to get into situations or to get into relationships with people who maybe wouldn't be a good influence on them because there's nobody around supervising, right? Those are things that the kids deal with. And on the other hand, the parents, when they finally do get home from working, are oftentimes tired, right? but instead of being able to rest or try to take some time for themselves, they have to jump immediately into the parenting role, okay, going from their job back into the work of parenting, loving their kids, feeding their kids, bathing their kids, disciplining their children, right? All of the things that go into raising healthy people, healthy kids, right? So you can see that that's a struggle for the parents as well. Now, if you add poverty issues into the mix, then you can see that it's even more stressful, right? Your book talks about the fact that people who are in single parent households, they tend to have less stability in the fact that they tend to move more frequently than people who are in dual adult households. And so there's a lot of issues that single parent children and parents and families are facing that make the day-to-day life of parenting and just getting through life a very different experience, right? So what this suggests is that we need to really think about the kinds of resources and support systems that we have in place for single parents in our society today. We know that children are facing lots of new and unique types of pressures growing up in the modern society that they weren't facing 20 or 30 years ago, related to the state of the world, violence in schools, bullying, cyber stuff. All of these situations make being a kid today a difficult thing, right? And also the research shows that single parents struggle much more than people who are living in a dual parent household, right? So we need to think about allocating support, or at least maybe providing some support to those people that we know who are single parents, right? But if you ever find yourself in a single parent situation, then I strongly encourage you to look at seeking out resources that will help to provide a support system for you, so that that support system will help to sort of pick up the slack in a sense, right? I mean, it's not going to make being a single parent easy, but there are resources out there for single parents and for single parents who are struggling with poverty. And so if you or someone you know is struggling or challenged with this kind of a situation, I strongly urge you to seek out resources for mental health, physical health. Sometimes there's resources related to food pantries where you can get help with, filling your fridge, right? Perhaps, having like healthy or safe childcare, such as like the YMCA or Big Brothers Big Sisters. That was a program that was developed in the 70s and 80s to help kids to have somewhere safe to go after school, so that they didn't have to sit in their home alone, right? So these are all resources that are available for single parent households, for parents and their children. And I encourage you to look into this if you or someone you know is faced with this situation. Let's look at the blended family system. In 1995, 46% of marriages in the United States were remarriages. Now, what we know about child rearing is that many people who get married do have children. So what this means is that when they remarry, they oftentimes bring their children into the new marriage with them. And in some cases, or even in many cases, their partner may have children as well. So again, blended families exist when you have two adults who are entering into a new relationship, okay, who have already had a past marriage or long-term partnership, and they are bringing the children with them into that new relationship or marriage, okay? Now, the Pew Research Center showed that in 2014, 40% of marriages were remarriages in the United States. So again, we do see a downward trend in terms of the remarriage scenario. So in 1995, 46% of marriages were remarriages. In 2014, only 40% were remarriages. This possibly suggests that people, when they end up leaving a first marriage, are less likely to want to get married nowadays than they were in 1995. The Pew Research Center also shows that in 2009, 16% of children were living in blended family systems. So this shows actually how prevalent it is to be in a blended family for American children today. In fact, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 1,300 new blended families being formed in America every single day. Can you believe that? It seems high, but Given the fact that first marriages have a 50% failure rate, and given the fact that most people do have children when they get married, it is not surprising that people are forming blended families at such a high rate. And as we can see, if we have approximately 50% of remarriages happening in the US in 2014, then it shows that the new blended family system is becoming actually much more prevalent than before. Now, what's interesting about these statistics is that they also show that women are less likely to want to remarry than men are. So I think that's a very interesting difference between men and women and their tendency to want to engage or invest in a long-term legal marriage a second time after the first marriage. We could speculate about the possibility of this being related to marriage satisfaction in the first marriage. Remember, in a previous slide, we talked about the fact that marriage is a benefit for people in terms of mental, physical, emotional health, resource benefits, long-term community stability, right? But remember that that statistic, marriage being a benefit for people, only holds for women if the women are satisfied in their marriages, okay? So we could speculate that perhaps women are less likely to remarry a second time around because maybe many of them were not as satisfied as they expected to be in their first marriages, and they just figure that they are better off on their own or engaging in more sort of informal relationships or perhaps cohabitation relationships rather than the legal institution of marriage, right? Now, obviously, the blended family system faces a unique set of challenges that a nuclear family system does not face, right? We've talked about these issues before, but given that a blended family is formed essentially from two families that existed prior, right? And then these two families are coming together to form a new family, we can assume that in most blended families, there will be more conflict and more stress as that family learns to work together as a unit, okay? The reason for this relates to the fact that each of these families that are coming together have a unique history, they have unique challenges and problems that they have faced together, they have unique value systems and ideologies about the way the world should be and is. They also have unique communication practices. They have unique assumptions about what good communication looks like. They have different assumptions about what good parenting looks like. The parents go in with a whole host of expectations about what the blended family should look like or will look like. The children go in to a blended family with perhaps fears of what it's going to be like. Maybe they don't even want their parent getting remarried to begin with. You can imagine trying to be a step parent to a child that didn't even want your parent to be remarried, right? Could be very challenging. So when people get remarried, they not only inherit the person and the history that the person they're married to has, but they also inherit children from the past. And those children have, in many cases, there's another parent involved, like the ex-spouse. So that can potentially cause stress for blended families because for many children coming into blended families, they may spend part of their time with one parent, perhaps their mother and the mother's new husband or the mother's new partner, and they may spend half the time with their father, right? And the father may be by himself. Perhaps the father has a girlfriend. Perhaps the father has a boyfriend. Perhaps the father is remarried, right? And so those children are expected to be extremely flexible and adaptable. And I could say that I think that it would be fairly challenging for most kids, okay? And you can think about this yourself. Maybe some of you actually experienced this growing up. It is probably challenging for children, okay, given that children need security, stability, predictability, right? The consistency of knowing what to expect on a day-to-day basis by having the same caregivers, the same rules, the same rituals, right? It is challenging for children who have to go between two blended families, right? And remember that the children who are living between two households, where each household is a remarriage, that is considered to be the binuclear family form, all right? So those kids are coexisting in a binuclear family because they actually have to live and function in two family systems on an ongoing basis. So for those children, they have perhaps less of the predictability, the stability, the consistency that children who live in one household with either a single parent or with two parents get to enjoy. And so we can see that the blended family system is unique. It has a unique set of challenges, expectations, norms, and ways to blend. I'm going to let you review the blended family trajectories on your own. If you have any questions about those different types of blended family trajectories in terms of how they form as a new unit, please feel free to email me and we can discuss it further. But suffice to say that the blended family system is an extremely unique system and that it faces a very challenging set of obstacles that people need to overcome in order to really become a unit that will be able to successfully nurture healthy children and keep the adults satisfied as well. These are all things to think about as we go about our lives. And if you yourself find yourself in a blended family today or in the future, again, I strongly urge you to seek out resources, information. There are a lot of books that have been written about these issues, about the unique challenges faced. I also encourage you to seek out counseling before blending a family so that you can get to the point where people are comfortable and able to have a safe space to talk about some of the concerns that they're going to bring into the family system. And I strongly encourage you, if you find yourself in a problem situation with a blended family, to seek out resources and counseling that will help you move through it. You do not have to become a statistic just because the statistics say that remarriages don't work that often. You can be proactive and you can seek out assistance and you can be the one who goes against those statistics and you can make your blended family successful with enough hard work, dedication, and commitment. So I think it's good to believe in ourselves, and it's also good to seek out help when we need it so that we can be proactive about creating the kind of family system that we want for ourselves and for our children. The extended family system deals with scenarios where we have 3 generations of people living together under the same roof. So this might include, for example, having grandma or grandpa living with you, and then, of course, you're living there, right, as probably the primary breadwinner, and then that would include having a child or children living in the home with you. In 1999, research showed that 5.6% of people were actually living with their parents. Now, after the 2007 recession that we had, there were many more people actually that ended up moving back in with their parents simply because they ran into financial difficulty because of the economic changes that took place. So we see that actually in the past, the extended family dwelling was much more common than it was in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But more recently, we're seeing trends go back to what they used to be, where you have 3 generations of people living under the same roof. So in some cases with extended families, you probably have the parents who are fulfilling certain roles in the home, right? But you also have the grandparents stepping in to help fulfill other roles, right? So for example, you might have mom filling the role of provider and controller, okay? Mom goes to work, she brings in the money, but because grandma is the one who is able to be at home all day, maybe before the kids go to school, after the kids come home from school, right? Then grandma steps in and is able to take on the role of the nurturer, right? Certainly, it's beneficial for children to be able to have an adult in the home when they come home from school. We discussed this in the single parent household slide just a few slides ago. So in many ways, the three generation extended family system can provide a lot of benefits for people in terms of additional support for the parents and for the children living in that system that would not be there, right, if the grandparent wasn't available. Now, you may have two-parent households that also have a grandparent living there, right? So in those households, you have even more support available for the children. And it's nice for the grandparents to be able to get to know their grandkids and to get to spend more time with them. Now let's take a different scenario where you have the extended family. And let's think of a scenario where instead of having grandma being someone who gets to care for the children, you have grandma as someone who needs to be cared for by their kid and by their grandkids, okay? So you have a lot of people like baby boomers nowadays, or even people, Generation Xers, my category, right? People who are in their 40s and 50s, and they have perhaps aging parents who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Now, in many cases, you have people who are caring for their parents, right? And their parents are dealing with any number of potential physical, mental, or emotional ailments that tend to be related to aging, right? So how does the communication change when instead of having grandma being in a nurturing role, you have grandma being in a situation where she needs to be cared for every day by her child and also her grandchildren, right? We can imagine that the type of communication that would characterize day-to-day living would be very different. We can also assume that in an extended family system where the primary parent is not only caring for their own children, but also caring for their parents, we can assume that in those systems that those people are facing a lot more financial stress, a lot more role strain, and a lot more challenges than people who are dealing with living with parents who are actually able to step into a caregiving, nurturing, or controlling role, right? So it's just really good to think about all the different types of situations or scenarios that can manifest when we have an extended family system. In many ways, the extended family provides a lot of benefits and stability for children and grandchildren living in that system. However, in some situations, like the one we just talked about, having an extended family situation with grandparents living at home could actually cause more stress and more strain for people, right? So these are all things to consider when we look at making a decision to have our parents moving in with us, or perhaps to have us living with our parents. Again, like all the previous slides, I strongly encourage you to seek out the resources and help and counseling that you need to manage these kinds of unique and challenging family situations effectively. There are resources out there to help you be successful if you find yourself in this situation, and I strongly urge you to access those so that you can be proactive about making your family life as happy as possible. To sum up this chapter, let's briefly address the way that family forms shape communication. Throughout this lecture, we've looked at the way that the different family forms shape the roles that people must assume in the family system in order to make things happen on a day-to-day basis and in order to raise healthy children whose needs are met. We talked about the fact that the dual adult household has more advantages than single parent households or even three-generation households in some cases, because there are two adults who are able to provide resources, time, energy, and devotion to helping the family run the way it needs to run. We also talked about the fact that people's roles may change depending on whether or not they find themselves in a single parent home or in a two-parent home or in a three-generation home. And you may have been raised in one type of a system as a child, and you may find yourself living in two or three different systems as an adult. So the roles that we take on are very dependent on life circumstances and none of us can ever really predict the different types of roles that we are going to have to assume in the course of our life, which is one of the reasons why it's such a good idea to learn about these different issues related to family forms and communication, so that when we are faced with family forms that are unexpected, we know how to execute our role effectively so that we can do a good job and have a happy family and home life. We also talked about the fact that every family form seeks to nurture and control the people who live within that family. For some people, such as married couples or cohabitating couples without children, the nurturing and the control day to day is happening based on just the couple and their needs as a couple, right? As a family form with just the two of them. You may also have this playing out with gay couples as well, okay? And you see that the marriage and long-term commitment that couples with children and couples without children have tends to provide stability in the family form. It tends to provide more resources for people so that they have access to things that they can use to nurture and to effectively control. And it just tends to provide more general mental health and well-being for people who are in long-term committed and satisfying relationships. We also talked about economic issues. We discussed the fact that having a dual income household where both adults are able to be gainfully employed significantly shapes communication in the family because there's more access to resources. There's also more access to different things that can help the children be successful. There's also more access to support that can help people get the time and help that they need to meet all of the family's needs. So for example, if you have dual income homes, if there is a shortage of time to do household chores or laundry, for example, then presumably there's more access to financial means in order to pay someone to come in to pick up the slack, okay? So that's a good example of the way that economic issues can play out in homes where there's two adult earners versus single parent homes or even three-generation homes where there's one person who is expected to shoulder the economic burden of running the entire family. We also looked at social issues and the way that social issues can define what it means to be a family and the different types of legitimacy that certain family forms get over others, right? We grew up, many of us, watching these typical television shows where we saw the typical nuclear family form playing out in multiple TV shows or movies or even comic books, throughout the media. Now, these media impressions give people a sense that what is normal is the typical nuclear traditional family model with a male and female husband and wife and their biological offspring. However, the Pew Research Trends and the U.S. Census Bureau and many other sources tell us that the family form that is becoming most common in the United States is not the nuclear family form. And there are lots of different variations of what families are looking like nowadays. And just because we have different variations in what constitutes a family doesn't mean that people are not meeting the needs of nurturing and control for both their partners, themselves, and also for their children. We also discussed the advantages and the challenges associated with each of the family forms. Some of the family systems tend to provide more time, energy, and resources so that people have greater access to meeting the needs of people in the system, the parents and the children. However, other family forms tend to face more stress. We talked about the fact that people who are single parents are much more likely to face poverty than people who are dual parents, right? And so we can think about all of these different advantages and challenges that exist based on family form. And I also emphasize the fact that even if you find yourself in a family system where you didn't expect to be in that, or you're facing a lot of challenges, then I strongly encourage you to seek out help in terms of resources, community advantages. Also, counseling is something that can be very useful in helping us to learn how to navigate our lives in ways that are most optimum and healthy for all people involved. This is the end of Chapter 2. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you found some information useful here. and I appreciate your consideration of these important issues as we move forward in the course. I'll talk to you all in Chapter 3. Thank you.